President Draupadi Murmu addressed the beginning of the budget session today with a joint address to both houses of the parliament ahead of the presentation of Budget 25-26 by reiterating the government's commitment to the middle class. Now, Chief Economic Advisor V. Anantha Nageswaran also gave a status report on the Indian economy in the economic review that he presented in the parliament, in fact, outside of the parliament today. As per the survey that was tabled in the parliament, India's economy grew at 6.4% for financial year 25. That's the number projected, driven by a rebound in rural demand, strong growth in construction and utilities, and a solid performance in the services sector. Retail headline inflation, meanwhile, softened from 5.4% in financial year 24 to 4.9% in April to December of 24 if you set aside the prices of tomatoes, onions and potatoes. So this was primarily driven by a reduction in core inflation. India's unemployment rate, meanwhile, has also declined from 6% in 2017-18 to 3.2% in 23-24, according to the document, adding that labour force participation and worker to population ratio have both indeed increased. These were the highlights to understand the economic survey, what it says about the macroeconomic picture. Joining me on the show is economist and journalist Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee. Also with me in the studio is my colleague Karthik Malhotra. Gentlemen, good afternoon. Karthik, coming to you first. Let's take our viewers through what the economic survey has to say. How has the economy done so far this year, and what's the projection for financial year 26?
You know, Shweta, I hate to sound like a naysayer, but I believe there is nothing new really that we have gotten to understand by way of the economic survey and the highlights of which that we've been able to read thus far. So, you know, whether you talk about India's growth projection, I think the economic survey is also pretty much saying what the National Statistics Office had said, that India is expected to grow at 6.4% this year. What is worrisome to me is that the projection for next year also doesn't look too good. So the projection for FY26, and there's a wide range which the economic survey gives, is likely to grow from 6.3% to 6.8%. So if you take the bottom part of that range, that next year the economy will grow at 6.3%, and assuming that this year we are able to grow at 6.4%, that means there's going to be a slowdown in growth next year. But even if you look at the higher end of that projection, which is 6.8%, then even 6.8% is much lower than the 8%, that 8.2% or so, and the long-term 8% average that we were hoping to grow at for the next few years for us to overtake, let's say, Germany and Japan as the immediate target, and towards Viksit Bharat 2047. So that is the sort of, you know, dampener in the economic survey to my mind, and you know, we'll have to figure out how budget could address some of these growth concerns, and not just this budget but successive budgets as well. On the other side, what I did appreciate about the economic survey was that, you know, the Chief Economic Advisor is sticking his neck out and saying that there is a real case for deregulation, and the government must get out of the way of business and let business function and operate, and not really become a spanner in the works of business growth. So I think at one level, batting for deregulation is one positive as far as the editorial take on the economic survey is concerned. But I think a pessimistic to realistic growth estimate for next year is worrisome.
Let's also quickly get to Shubhamoy. Sure. What are you making with what has come out regards to the macroeconomic numbers? Are you happy with the projections of $5 trillion economy by FY28, 6.8 by FY30? Are these numbers realistic to you, given that rupee has been depreciating at a very fast clip?
Yeah, the numbers look realistic. That's okay, because these numbers essentially are, you know, taking on a very conservative estimate. And most of the growth drivers in the economy are essentially coming from the agricultural sector. Now, if you're saying the agricultural sector, that is essentially a domestic sector that doesn't have too much connectivity with the rest of the world. The rest of it is the services sector, which has more or less been able to keep up its push. The big problem is about a manufacturing sector and what it does with respect to the export pessimism that's happening in the rest of the world. So all things taken together, 6.3 to 6.7, you know, that sort of a range is a fairly conservative estimate. What I would take on what Karthik was saying, and that's right, that the economic survey, for instance, doesn't talk about some of the basic challenges that's coming up in the economy. And one of those is not only the issue of consumption, but also about the issue of freebies and the problems of finances, the state finances and what it can do. We have just announced the pay commission. Now, that was not a surprise. I would have thought that some consideration of what is happening to the government's wage bill, the subsidy bill, the issues regarding the rising committedness of government expenditure, both at the central level and at the state level. And mind you, this is possible because the RBI analysis has already flagged these issues. So it would have been interesting to have seen how if the economic survey had looked at these issues, primarily because the survey I was listening with very lot of intent to what you're saying about the issues about deregulation and others. Now, those are practical things which the survey is not necessarily the place where those decisions will be made, or the central government will make the decisions. But on central state finances, an economic survey's comment on how the central finances will pan out, what are the risks, is it happening, would have been significant. I would have thought that given the fact that there's been so much of a discussion even from the Prime Minister about issues like freebies, impact on the state of the public finance, is something that is very, very significant, considering that it also does talk about the risks from AI and the labor market. So that was an opportunity which I thought it had missed. Yes.
Karthik, I think interesting point that I believe Shubhamoy was making, that this comes before DeepSeek, which was likely to change the fortunes of workforce, companies, how they function, how they attract more labor going forward, and perhaps revolutionize the way, labor workforce participates in economy.
You're right. Though I think, the job of the economic survey largely is to present a report card of the government and a report card of the country for the ongoing year, right? So how technology is likely to disrupt industries going forward, or work life going forward, or governments going forward, is something that yes, the economic survey does periodically touch upon, but I think DeepSeek is too recent an example for the economic survey to have objectively been able to include. But you're right. I think, what is also curious to my mind, and this is something that you mentioned as you opened this discussion, Shweta, is that even when you talk about inflation softening, right, I think the economic survey has been very selective in identifying periods and factors that go into the data that it projects. So, for example, if you look at the EPFO numbers, and I'm talking about formal employment here, when you talk about EPFO numbers, the economic survey says that in the April to December period, there have been as many as 95 lakh jobs that have been created. The comparison it makes is to the pre-COVID FY19, FY20 era, where a total of just about 65 odd lakhs of jobs were created in the formal sector. So, you're cherry picking on your comparison points, and that is something that often tends to confuse you on the real trajectory of growth that the country is taking. Now, if you look at FY20, for example, in FY24, which is the year that ended on 31st March 2024, last year, if you look at the jobs created as per the same EPFO data, that number was at about 1.3 crore people, right, above the age of 18 who got employed for the first time. So these were enrollments in EPFO. So if you were to extrapolate the data from April to November, and add another 50% to that for the balance December, Jan, Feb, March, you're looking at almost the same number. So
absolutely.
On a year-to-year basis, has there been a growth in jobs? I think the economic survey next year will tell us perhaps not. But as of now, as things stand right now, it doesn't factor that in. The question you were asking, Shubhamoy, earlier about what Donald Trump could do and how that is something which can impact not just India's growth, but
and
overall global growth.
Right.
Yeah, so we really don't know right now, and it's hard to predict. Will the tariffs come? Will the tariffs not come? Will US begin drilling more and start exporting more oil? Will the pressure that Donald Trump is putting on oil-producing nations to cut down on prices, how much of that is actually going to fructify into real action is something that right now is difficult for anybody, including the chief economic advisor, to arrive at something concrete about. However, I think certain guardrails and certain red flags, could have been included in the economic survey.
Absolutely. But apart from the factors that you cannot really predict as to how the economy will perform, whether tariffs will come or not come, whether there is going to be more thrust on fossil fuel drilling, there are some tangible movements, and that is especially on currency front, where we have seen currency depreciating at a really fast clip, and that is what economic survey talks about. Going back to the data that has come in by the way of how much Indian currency has fallen vis-a-vis other nations, South Korea, there was an example of Brazil. The data was up until 6th of January, but the real action only happened around 20th of January, and that data again is not accounted for.
You're right. So I think, the economic survey also had to put a stop date to its own data collection and then putting all of that into perspective. So yeah, I mean, let's cut some slack to the chief economic advisor. I think he would have needed those 20-25 days to really crunch that data and prepare a fairly robust document. But you're right. I think the rupee has depreciated vis-a-vis the dollar, and that is something that again has to do with Donald Trump and the fact that that the greenback is being used as a hedge, because you don't know again which way the tariffs are going to go and how the global economy is going to pan out, with US pretty much being in the driver's seat of decision making that impacts global economies. So yeah, I think coming back to the point, yes, till 6th of January, the data that we had kept a rupee which was, about a rupee stronger against the dollar. Right now, as of this morning, the rupee was at about 86.65 to a dollar, and that is something that we have seen, a solid depreciation in the currency, which also tells us that in pure dollar-denominated GDP terms, India's target of 5 trillion by 2028, FY28, is something that may actually not come through, simply because if the rupee continues to depreciate the way it does, you might be growing in rupee terms, in absolute value of currency and the absolute value of production that is happening in the country. You may actually show growth as a rupee denominated growth. But when you convert that on the exchange rate against the dollar, and the rupee continues to depreciate, then perhaps that $5 trillion dream, which the economic survey does state as something that will happen by FY28 and a $6.3 trillion by FY30, is something that may find roadblocks in the depreciating currency.
I think both Karthik and I, while we were going through the economic survey, found that some of the data was cherry-picked perhaps to suit the government, which also includes data on EPFO numbers, prior COVID, post-COVID, then the data on inflation, which for some reason does not really include price-sensitive tomato, onion, potato. Is that something you also drew out of the economic survey?
That's something that's there, but then that almost every, to give credit, almost every economic survey takes on data till the end of November. It's the April to November period. In fact, some of the data that it stops at is October, and that's more or less true for every economic survey down the years. So it takes on down the year. What it doesn't do, and that's a very good thing it has not done, it has not compared apples with oranges. The actual estimates which comes out of the CGA data of government finances, and ignoring that to look at the budget estimate. That it has not done. In one of the years, that was something that was done, and that actually took made the economic surveys analysis really not on. And that was something that we have fortunately gone out of. So that way, I would say there is more data transparency now. On the employment data, I would give it the point that, the employment data is still stabilizing. The PLFS data is sort of, coming into a sort of a stability. So there is occasion, and obviously a government would try to say that, look, I am on a better footing as far as my set of numbers are concerned. So that, I suppose, would be, I think would be fair enough to say that that's something that is a judgment call, and the economic and the chief economic advisor is within his remit to take it on. The big thing that it talks about also is of the foreign direct investment. This is something that has really been talked about a lot. And while the chapter on foreign direct investment, the external sector, talks a lot about what are the constraints in FDI, but it goes on to a lot of this tariff issues. And the interesting thing that it talks about is that it says India faces a lot of non-tariff barriers. Tariff barriers may have come down in the corresponding countries, but non-tariff barriers like the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the deforestation regulations, those have actually risen, and it makes it a very strong point to say that given all those things, it is not a fair thing to say that India is high, Indian tariffs are high. Now, coming just a day before the budget, it's a very interesting read as to whether it's a direction finder for the finance minister in terms of her lookout for what she would be presenting in terms of her look on the customs regime,
right,
which we are talking about. And that comes down to directly to what Karthik was saying earlier about the impact of the Donald Trump regime, where tariffs will be a very major issue that will be discussed and flagged. So I think that's a very interesting conservative position that has been taken in the economic survey, and I would think it towards for it. Yeah.
All right, and I think we'll have to wait and watch out for what Nirmala Sitharaman really comes around with when it comes to indirect taxes, customs duty, whether tariffs will go up or down, whether there will be a tit-for-tat attempt made by India. Remember, there's no tariff announcement on India just as yet, but all eyes will be on budget tomorrow. Shubhamoy, Karthik, thank you very much for taking time out. Thank you.